Hello, welcome to the Bible K through 12. This is the sixth grade, part E, and this is the last video that I'm going to do on the Old Testament. The long journey for those of you who have stuck with me, and for me. In a way, I'm regretting it because I would like to dwell some more, but really, this is supposed to be an introduction to the Bible and not a verse by verse study of the Bible. So we're going to move on. But first, I would just like to pause and think about the Old Testament. So I entitled this My Thoughts on the Old Testament. And I divided this into good stuff and bad stuff. And by that, I mean that there were some very positive things that were going on throughout the Old Testament. And there were also some struggles, some times of setback and other situations that are also recorded. It doesn't mean that God was failing in those times. It doesn't even mean in all cases that God's people were failing. But nevertheless, we would have to put them under that bad stuff category. So first, we'll start with the good stuff. First of all, there is in the Old Testament a description of organized religion. Now, organized religion has a bad reputation in the era in which we live. And I have made reference to that before in this series. But there are a lot of good things about organized religion, and especially the organized religion of the Old Testament will begin with the laws. Over 600, somebody counted them up many hundreds of years ago. And these gave guidance to people, helped people to understand God's will for their lives, helped to put a fine point on what's right and what's wrong. And so it had some real positive effects on people's lives and was a foundation for their understanding of how to serve God. There is also worship that is part of organized religion. And there are some detailed descriptions and instructions about various kinds of sacrifices and other activities, mostly performed by priests on behalf of the people. But as you work your way through those and imagine the people experiencing those, if only by observing what the priest was doing, you get some understanding of the relationship between God and people. One example is the use of animal sacrifice, blood sacrifice, and how important that was in organized religion of the Hebrew people. And the point of that is that there was death, there was shed blood, because of sin. And it is that blood is called an atonement for sin. It is a vehicle by which sin is propitiated. That is, that God's wrath is turned aside because of the sacrifice. Then there are the festivals. And these, of course, are part of organized religion. They were part of the law. They were commanded. But they were also just a good time. They were an opportunity. In most cases, there was a certain element of joy, rejoicing, the celebration, and so forth. And it was a communal situation, so that people gathered together to experience the festivals. Now, in some cases, there was a more somber tone, but even in those cases, there was a sense of community and a sense of hope, a sense of ultimately a sense of joy in rejoicing in the Lord. Connected with all of this is the priesthood, a recognition that certain people were set aside for the priesthood. And when you think about it, there was a pretty heavy investment in the priesthood of the 12 tribes. One tribe is the priestly tribe, the tribe of Levi, and then not all of them were priests, but they were in some cases helpers to the priests and so forth. But a lot of people were involved in organized religion, and it tells how important God is for these people. All in all, organized religion provided structure, instruction, and visual representation. So people experienced God in structure, in a liturgy, in following the way things were supposed to be. They received instruction in righteousness, holiness, and what it is to serve God. And they had a visual representation. They saw with their very eyes, for example, the animal sacrifices and so forth. So it was effective in helping the people get an understanding of who they were and who God is. Now, in addition to this, there were what I call spiritual experiences. These may have been incorporated into organized religion. They may have been accompanied organized religion, but not always. Personal prayer. There's a beautiful story of the woman who would become Samuel, the great prophet's mother, and how she prayed so earnestly for a child. And that caught the attention of the high priest. There was also the prophets, and they were leaders of the people. They helped the people get sort of a vision of God, and they helped the people draw close to God. They heard the word of God through the prophets, as well as by other means. There were miracles. There were times when it was obvious that God had intervened in the lives of people. There were miracle children of women who had not born a child. There were defeat of enemies. There was victory in warfare when the odds seemed against them. Uh, there was there were cases of escape from captivity. For example, of course, the greatest of all, the Exodus from Egypt. Um, so these were interventions from God, spiritual experiences. All of this, or most of this, although in some cases organized religion may have played a role, but most of this was disorganized, or what I call charismatic religious experience. Uh, so it was something that God did, and it didn't have to be connected to the ordinary organized religious structure. Of course, the Bible, the Old Testament, is about the creation of and the maintenance of the nation of Israel. Uh, the calling of Abraham, the 12 tribes as from the sons of Jacob, uh, the gathering of the people at Mount Sinai after the Exodus through the Red Sea, the entrance into the promised land under the leadership of Joshua. All of these things and more were the part of the creation and maintenance of Israel. These events took place under the individual leaders, the patriarchs. I mentioned Abraham and others, Moses, Joshua, uh, the uh, the judges such as Gideon and Deborah and so forth. And then these uh, experiences that were important in the creation and maintenance of Israel took place at big events that were celebrated throughout the history of the people in the Psalms and so forth. The Exodus through the Red Sea, the experience at Mount Sinai, I've already mentioned these, the wilderness wanderings and the guidance of God in those. All of this was part of what it took to build a nation. There was eventually the monarchy, and of course that had a very early climax in David, the great king. But then there was the promise that he would be the leader of a great family of leaders, of kings. The sort of end of the Old Testament story was the return from exile, the horrible 586-87 destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, the carrying away of the people into Babylon in captivity, that ended with the return from exile. All of this was working toward the creation, not just of another government, not just of another state, not just of another country that had a name and a capital, but of a people, the people of God, the nation of Israel. There was in the background throughout the Old Testament, but we see certain times where it kind of comes to the fore for sometimes just a few verses in a particular book, but we see there is a leadership from God toward inclusion of the Gentiles. Abraham is told that in you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. We see the amazing story of one man who was so angry with God that he resisted God's call, and yet God wanted him to know how much he cared about the Gentiles. And so he would learn and relearn through him, Jonah, that God was conscious of the needs even of the fiercest warriors on the earth, the Ninevites, and the Assyrian Empire. There is in the Old Testament a promise of a future. In some cases, it's nebulous, it's hard to follow exactly where God is leading, but he wants the people to know that there will come a day when God will be triumphant and restore the whole earth, that he really is in a much bigger business than sometimes their narrow, small minds could grasp, and the same could be said of us. One of the themes of those forward-looking prophecies is the term, the day of the Lord. That day will come. And when it comes, there will be some great things happen and some terrifying things happen as God sets things right. And then there is a person. There is a person that the Hebrew people would eventually learn to look forward to. And they called him the Anointed One, the Messiah. And so that was a part of the promise of the future. All right, now then, I want to continue and talk about the bad stuff, because the Old Testament is quite honest, eyes wide open, pays attention to what people do and what people don't do. There are at times descriptions of the sins of individuals that we generally think of as being great, and yet we find them at times, as one person called them, wormy. They were just sinful, just like the rest of us. We find Abraham lying to try to protect himself. We see the failures of King Saul a number of times. And David, of course, had that terrible sin of adultery with Bathsheba. And then Solomon, he starts out so strong and so great, but toward the end, he begins to just indulge himself and has a bunch of wives, and they are mostly from other countries, and they bring in idolatry And so Solomon was poisoning the waters, so to speak, of Israel toward the end. Not only of these individuals, but there were also sins of the people. Uh, the prophets come down on the people. They don't name any particular person. They're saying, hey, a bunch of you. Now, they will recognize that they're not all that way, but there are too many of them that were sinful, and it angered God, and it eventually resulted in the downfall of the people. One of those sins was idolatry. Again and again and again, we find this sin of going after other gods, of apostatizing, of just leaving God behind and chasing after false gods. And as they do, they get in trouble with God. There are what I call individual sins. For example, sexual sin, violence, mistreatment of the poor, mistreatment of widows and orphans. Again and again, you see that hammered on, because you see these were the vulnerable people. These, in some cases, were people who had no hope unless somebody rescued them. And there were people that did just the opposite. They abused them and mistreated them. And God noticed. God pointed it out. There is a category, in this category of bad stuff, the divided kingdom. It marked a low point, and things deteriorated from there. The northern kingdom, southern kingdom. We find the northern kingdom was just awful in terms of its idolatry, but eventually the southern kingdom did its best to catch up. And so it was a bad situation with this dividing of the kingdom. Along with this, we find individual kings especially would resort to making pacts, making treaties with other nations that were not to Israel or Judah, the north or south kingdom, not to their benefit. Instead, it was would contribute to their downfall. So the involvement with other nations we could include as one of the bad things that was going on. Eventually, of course, the Old Testament describes, and when it describes it, then it gives the reasons. It says this happened because, and so we see the collapse, first of the north, then of the south. And so as that happens in each case, the Old Testament is very clear-eyed, very just with eyes wide open, looks straight at this situation, says, you know, if these people had obeyed God, if they had not gone into idolatry, if they had not messed around with other nations, if they had not gotten involved in all the sins that they did, this would not have happened. The collapse of the two nations was the final end for them. Now then, I want to just finish up by thinking about the anticipation of the New Testament, that we find in the Old Testament some forward-looking thoughts, generally in the nature of prophecies, but other ways in which the Old Testament anticipates the New Testament. First of all, there were the prophecies, the prophets of various kinds, what we call major prophets, minor prophets, uh, independent prophets who did not write, as well as the writing prophets. They talked about the Messiah, which we believe was Jesus. They talk about the day of the Lord, which is a very complex subject, and exactly what it means is up for discussion, but involves the coming of the Messiah. They talk about Gentiles being incorporated, as I've already mentioned, into the people of God. And these all were looking forward and anticipation of what we see in the New Testament. In addition to that, there is a pattern of salvation that is laid in the Old Testament. There's an understanding, first of all, that God is where salvation is. You know, you're not going to get God, you're not going to get salvation off somewhere else, just doing your own thing or philosophizing, but rather as you go to God for salvation, you find it. And then, of course, there is the blood sacrifice that was so important in the Old Testament that anticipates the cross of Jesus Christ. And so there is this pattern of salvation that is anticipated in the Old Testament. And then I just entitled this little piece in terms of what is anticipating the New Testament, the whole experience of the Old Testament. It is, in one sense, a finished product. In one sense, it is all about Israel. In one sense, it is, as one person put it, the rise and fall of the Hebrew nation. All of those things, but at the same time, it is an experience of a whole group of people that anticipates the New Testament. First of all, foundational, the reality of God. That is through and through, page after page. God is real, and God is interested in people and loves people and wants to help people in their misery. The miracles, of course, that testify to the reality of God. The pattern of worship that I've already mentioned that anticipates the New Testament. The teachings that we find throughout the Old Testament that anticipate, again, teaching and lifestyle and so forth that we find in the New Testament. For example, the sanctity of marriage, the love of neighbor, obedience to God, and the reality of the Holy Spirit. All of these, and we could just pile on all sorts of additional material, but all of this look forward and, in a sense, is completed in the New Testament. Well, bye-bye Old Testament. In terms of this course, I hope that it is not bye-bye, but it is an introduction for you. And I hope that some of it maybe gets your curiosity going, makes you want to dig into the Old Testament and find some of these things for yourself and much more. Again, I'm gratified that some people hang in here with me. that some people watch these videos, that some people perhaps get something out of them. And I hope that you are one of those folks and that you'll stick around as we begin to make videos concerning the New Testament. Thank you for watching. And remember that there is a great good news experience God has for you.